Welcome, everybody. I believe we're live, if the platform is to be believed. So welcome to our talk today about seamless Lando and Lagoon integration. My name's Brian. I'm the Amazy.io Partner Manager, currently living in Barbados until the end of January. I've worked for Amazy Labs for several years on the agency side using Lagoon and joined Amazy.io very recently. I'm also very happy to introduce Michael Schmidt and Mike Pirog from Amazy.io and Tandem, respectively. And maybe you can just do some quick introductions, starting with Michael Schmidt.
Yes, hello everybody. Yeah, people call me usually Schnitzel, but I've heard in this Zoom I'm only be referenced as Mike, so to make it more confusing. I'm the CTO of Amazy.io, one of the founders, and also one of the main ideas giver of Lagoon. And with that, yeah, we reached out to Tandem and said, hey, why don't we connect to open source tools? And that's what we did.
Awesome. And Mike, over to you.
Yeah, for the sake of keeping this webinar less confusing, I will also go as Mike. So there should be no confusion at all. Yes, I am Mike. I am Mike Pirog. I am the CTO at Tandem. We're a digital agency, but we also make Lando, which is an open source development environment, and I'm one of the maintainers.
Awesome. Thank you to both the mics. I feel like we need some mic disambiguation software for the closed captions that they're going to put on this, I'm sure. Cool. So we're going to keep this chat kind of, like I mentioned to Michael, fireside-y. I'm very interested to hear from both of you about your perspectives, particularly on local development and why these tools are necessary and how that connects to the container topic and scalable hosting. But a question for both of you, and you can kind of riff off each other, I guess, is like, what is the history of local development? I think we've all been in this for a while, and it wasn't always the case that development would work like this. So, what's the history? How did we arrive at this point? I guess.
I'll let Mike answer that.
I mean, how much time do we have? Yeah, I mean, the brief history of local development, I think, is that for the longest time, just using a text editor in a web browser was sufficient. So by the longest time, I mean, front page used to be a thing and it was cool, and Dreamweaver was a thing and it was cool, and that was sufficient. And then for a long period of time after that, like sort of the maps of the world, I think were okay. Just give me PHP, give me a database, I can do most of my stuff. Versions don't really matter. Like I don't really need too much outside of that. And then probably around like 5-6 years ago, a big change sort of started happening. One, container technology became easier to use, more accessible, and more mature as a thing. And probably more importantly, just the complexity of developing a web application all of a sudden became increasingly complex. And that trend has accelerated. It hasn't slowed down. So for me, where we're at now is, and this is true not just of local development, but development in general and hosting in general, is that developing a modern web application is a complex endeavor. It requires a lot of different pieces that are all individually difficult to set up. So things like Lando, things like Lagoon, at the end of the day, we're talking about how do we reduce that complexity. Being a developer is hard enough. Throw all this other stuff on there, it's almost impossible. So how can we make that experience a little bit easier?
Michael,
yeah, for me,
add to that?
I think I can echo what Mike said. It's really like, I think we didn't really realize when we started to use like more complex things. Like I used to be a Drupal developer myself, and yeah, like just one app PHP version was perfectly fine. It didn't matter which one really, and some kind of database. But as we had more complex systems, it got very fast that it was clear that we not only need much more running locally, like how do you run an Elasticsearch or an Solr, because suddenly we depended on these tools to develop, to build custom integrations. Like how do you run all of these locally in different, on a Linux and a Windows and a Mac at the same time, and just like specific versions, because you maybe needed specific versions of these tools. And so that's where we tried for a long time, we tried to work with VMs. which sounded at the beginning very good, because you can provision your VM the exactly same that you provision the servers. But especially for an agency that has like 4 or 5 different projects running at the same time, you ended up like running multiple VMs, and they took a long time to start and to stop. And so then that's where we then really searched further and found with containers a possibility to have the really same systems everywhere, or the same configuration, the same version, but also having a system that really fast starts and stops the sites, which is crucial for anybody that has more than one website that they need to maintain, which is the case for almost every agency out there.
Yeah. I suppose almost all agencies these days have got multiple things going on at the same time, juggling between things. So it becomes more and more.
When my business partner and 2 other gentlemen started Calamuna about 8 years ago, like we had standardized on the Pantheon platform. That's all of our sites were on Pantheon. We even rejected clients if they weren't on Pantheon or wouldn't move to Pantheon. And now it's very rare to find someone who's like committed, who can commit to just one hosting provider. It's very, very rare. So you really want a tool that you don't want to have, like the one tool for Pantheon, the one tool for platform, the one tool for everything else. You want to just have the one tool that works with all of them, and the interface is the same. Like that's like the holy grail developer experience. And the amount of users that we have now versus like even a few years ago is significantly different, and almost 10x different. And we like to pat ourselves on the back and think, oh, this is because we've done such a good job making this. And I think that we've done a pretty good job. But I think the real thing is that like this kind of development experience has moved from a nice to have to just a must have, especially if you're a developer working on more than one project or has more than one collaborator.
Yeah, that's nice pivot into this. Yeah, Karen, Michael.
And that was one of the reasons that we also said, like from a Lagoon perspective, we don't want to build our own island with our own local development tools. Like we realized quite fast that what is really sad is maybe the wrong word, but what is really a problem is that if you install Docker locally, Docker itself doesn't actually bring you a real good web development experience, because you have missing like pieces like certificate issues, SSH keys, and just in general, like it's a very raw Docker experience. And so as a developer, you want to test HTTPS, but the certificates are not there and all that stuff. And so we built our own tool called Pygmy, more like out of need, to say, hey, okay, we need an HA proxy running and thing here and there, and that was okay. And for the longest time, if you wanted to use Lagoon, and which you will use if you host with Amaze.io, you had to use that tool, and that's always felt very wrong somehow, because like Mike said, we have so many agencies that have all these different platform providers. And so we realized, like Drupal itself, the whole community, we need to get off the island. And so we got off our own local development tool island and said, okay, instead of hiring people that continue to use or develop Pygmy, even though it is still continues to be maintained, but it never will reach the niceness of the cool experience that Lando has. So we reached out to Lando and said, hey, let's work together. At the end, we're both open source companies, which is great. We can help each other. And yeah, I really envisioning that in the end, that an agency just basically installs Lando on their developers' computers, and with that, they can, no matter if it's now Lagoon or Platform or Pantheon or Acquia or whatever, they can deploy with one unified system. And I think that's really what we believe will help everybody at the end, to have good experiences and very efficient developers, because at the end, wasting time is something we all hate. And so we really hope that with integrating existing tools that we can make less wasted time.
Yeah, and wasted time in agencies is basically the whole game these days. If you can figure out that, you can win the game. Mike, from the Lando side, maybe give us the 30,000-foot overview of what's actually going on in the box. Like, I'm sure you would have had to see Pygmy during doing your development. So how does it differ? What's kind of going on inside?
Yeah, so I mean, on the high level pitch on Lando is, sort of been hinted at already, which is that this is the one tool that you can use for all your development. So that should be true whether you're on Mac or Linux or Windows. It should be true whether you're using Lagoon or Mazy.io's like hosted solution or platform or Pantheon or Acquia or AWS or whatever. And the idea basically is like, you have a configuration file, you check into your Git repo. It's sort of development dependency management, for lack of a better way to describe it. You can clone the repository down, you can run Lando start, and then when that's done, you should have all the things that you need to sort of develop, test, and deploy your project. And by that, I mean, you should have the infrastructure that you need to sort of launch the project. So that would be things like Redis or Solr or the PHP version or Node version. The tools you need to develop. So that's like Composer, or for Drupal, that's like, Composer, Drush, maybe Drupal console, and then some interactivity with some remote environment. So that's the sort of like that's the high level pitch on what Lando is. Behind the scenes, it's a Docker, sort of a Docker superset, a Docker utility, a Docker wrapper. People have said that. I think calling it a Docker wrapper sort of is a cheap way to describe it, because it doesn't do it justice, the kinds of things that it does. This is like sort of like describing, what's a good example, like an airplane as like an engine wrapper. It's like, the airplane's got more than just the engine.
Sure.
But like fundamentally, what Lando is doing is making Docker Compose files sort of on the fly based on your configuration. And the idea again is to go back to this theme of reducing complexity. Docker is difficult to do, but it solves a problem and makes something easier. Docker Compose makes Docker itself easier. Lando just sort of extends that one extra level and makes Docker Compose itself easier by exposing just like, here are like the 5 things you really have to care about. Don't worry about everything else. We'll take care of that. So that's sort of the idea.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we've got the local development side of the conversation kind of spoken about to some extent, or going. Michael, Mazy.io, Mike, maybe tell us how Lagoon fits into the story. Like, how's the, what is its job? I think a lot of developers that I run across and a lot of agencies I run across see local development as part of what Lagoon does. And I guess that's maybe not the full story. Maybe unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, so Lagoon is basically an application delivery tool, or at least in the Kubernetes community, that's what you would describe these type of tools. It really tries to make it super easy for a developer to deploy their applications onto a Kubernetes cluster, without the need that you usually need to deploy an application to Kubernetes. So for example, that's like, you need to write Helm charts. You need to store these Helm charts somewhere. You need to share them with different developers. You need to, Kubernetes does not actually build your Docker images. You need to do that by yourself, and then you need to push them to a Docker registry, and you need to make sure that this Docker registry is not publicly available, because then somebody steals your data. So you need to secure them, and you also want to have like different environments for different branches. So you have a dev and a staging and the production, for example, but you maybe also want to deploy pull requests. You want to run cron jobs. You want to run, you want to have a backup system. You want to have a UI that you can see when did we deploy the last time. You maybe want to allow people to deploy that don't have Git access. So all these tools, none of this is given by you by Kubernetes if you just start the Kubernetes cluster, because a Kubernetes cluster itself is basically just a raw piece. It's like a raw diamond that you need to make sure that it does what you want. And so that's what Lagoon does. So Lagoon basically sits between your Git repository and the Kubernetes cluster, and it will receive webhooks and will look into the Git repository. So Lagoon uses GitOps ideas in terms of you configure the infrastructure inside the Git repository. So the Git repository, like the Docker Compose YAML in there, that is also used by Lando to start local containers, is also used by Lagoon to figure out, oh, you need a PHP, you need an Nginx, you need a Varnish. And so then Lagoon will then, internally we use Helm to create the templates for these different Kubernetes objects. And then Lagoon will actually talk to the Kubernetes cluster and do all of this for you. So it basically makes it super easy for developers, and easy literally means you just need to commit into your Git branch, you push, and that's it. You wait a couple of minutes, and 2 or 3 minutes later, you have a message in your Slack that says, hey, we deployed to the Kubernetes cluster. So that's basically what the idea of Lagoon is. And we did all of this because when we started at Amazy to use Kubernetes, we realized that while it's great, after you have the application inside the cluster, it's auto-scaling and auto-healing and whatever else that there is. But to get it in there, it's super hard. You need to know a lot about containers and how Kubernetes works. And so that's what Lagoon tries to do. And so Lagoon itself, it is correct, does not technically worry or do anything about local development. The only piece that we really have to do something is we both, Lando and Lagoon, both share the Docker Compose YAML file to define which containers. And because both systems are fully Docker-based or container-based, we can actually use the same container images in both places. So Lando will use the same Docker images that Lagoon uses to deploy to Kubernetes. So you have exactly the same PHP version, the same MySQL version, the same Varnish version, and also the same configurations. So it even allows you, if you need to change the Nginx for any reason, the same config that you do this to do locally will also happen later in production. And that's one of the things that I always envisioned, is to have a system that behaves the same way locally and then in production. And with Lando and Lagoon and containers and Kubernetes, we found that.
Maybe
I remember like maybe four DrupalCons ago, I was talking to Michael because we had this summit. Hey man. Sorry.
surprise entry. And
yeah. I mean, it was only a matter of time. Why is the door closed? Yeah, I remember like 4 or 5 DrupalCons ago. Michael and I were chatting, and we were doing I think this sort of like local development consolidation BOF or something like that, where there was some desire to like for us all to like standardize on the same images. And like, as you would expect, everyone was sort of just like, oh yeah, like maybe, but like I kind of like my images. And I remember afterwards talking to Michael and being like, I'd love to use somebody else's images. Like I don't want to maintain these images. It's like not really what Lando's like purpose is, to maintain these images, like to facilitate like the orchestration of these images and do all the things around these images. And I remember being like, yeah, like we'd love to like standardize on the Lagoon images. And I remember I think Michael and I were both like, yeah, like that's a good idea. We should do that. And that was 4 years ago, but now we can say mission accomplished. We've done it. So it's very cool that like when you run the Lando, Lagoon recipe, it's like you're running the Lagoon containers. They're exactly the same containers that you're running when you run in production on Lagoon. So I think that's like one of the very cool things that we were able to do. And it's just easier. There's like one config file, one set of images. They work on both tools, and that's, I think, the ideal way to do it.
It's probably, well, I'm hoping there's a lot of fairly new, sort of new to the industry developers in the that are listening to this conversation. And I'm interested to hear from both of you. There's a lot of buzzwords that flow around in the DevOps space, Kubernetes, containers, now we've got Lando and Lagoon and 2 mics, like things get confusing kind of quickly. How important do you two feel it is for developers to really know what's going on? Like, how important is it for a web developer whose day-to-day life is about building websites to really like know what Kubernetes is or containers are? And if it is important, not to preempt the conversation, but if it is important, at which point in somebody's career should they start digging into the stuff? Is this like know it when you come in the door on day one, or like, how do you guys feel about that?
Yeah. I mean, that's actually one thing that we really try to do with Lagoon as well, is to give a path for somebody that has never used Kubernetes to actually have a guided way into Kubernetes. Because I really believe the more you know about how the infrastructure works, or how the servers work, or how the platform works, the better decisions you will do as a developer. So I'm all for if a person wants to read down to the TCP/IP kernel stack, go ahead, feel free. Like you will probably realize something about that will help you with caching or whatever. But I don't think it is a requirement to go in. So I feel like if somebody just wants to really focus on, let's say, PHP or Node.js or whatever, and doesn't really want to worry about the containers and auto-scaling and load balancers and all that stuff, they shouldn't have to first read this. Like, it shouldn't be that you start your job as a developer and the first thing is you have to learn about all these other things. Like, if you look at race car drivers, for example, they're really good in driving the car. They're probably not good mechanics. They might understand how the engine works, but they're not the people that actually develop the new engine. That's what you have mechanics for. And so I feel I want to do it very similar. What is special about Lagoon, and the same also for Lando, is that it's completely open source. So you can actually go in there and look, what is it doing? And the fact that Lagoon is open source, you can also point it to your own Kubernetes cluster and you can look what it's doing. And so I think this is also a great possibility to, like, if you're interested, you can dig deeper. You can go to the Kubernetes cluster. You can see how deployment works. We try to document a lot about reasoning why Lagoon does specific things. It's all documented in the code. And we also have done many sessions about internals, like that we explain why things are happening in a certain way. And so it's really about also educating people about the craziness of Kubernetes and things like that. So that's how I feel it. Like, it should be, you shouldn't need any knowledge to deploy into Kubernetes, but if you want to learn it, you should have the capability to jump in and do it, and maybe improve it at the end. Like, that's the best point for us, that we maybe have people that come back and saying, hey, I have an idea to make this better.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most accurate, if we're being sort of academic about it, I think the most accurate way to describe Lando is as a DevOps tool. But this is not how we talk about it. This is not how we talk about it. I mean, it's a DevOps tool made for developers. We talk about it like it's just a developer tool, and there's a small percentage of Lando users who will like go sort of like Michael was saying, we'll go down and get dirty in like the Docker level itself. But the vast majority of Lando users, they don't even know what Docker is. Like, Lando will automatically install Docker for them. They won't have to like deal with any Docker config. So I think the idea for us is like, we make it as easy as possible. Just like go to the website, download the thing, like it's got an installer, you run through it, like you read the documentation, there's a config file, you change a couple settings around, and like that should be enough to get you pretty far down the road. So, you should be able to be like Lando proficient within like 5 minutes, basically. And you don't need to know what Docker is or what Kubernetes is or any of those things, really. You just need to know, like, I've got the site running. It's like close enough to production where that's like not going to be a big deal. If I mess something up locally, it'll probably break there as well. And that's the idea. Like, you really shouldn't have to know anything. Certainly, if you want to, you can. I obviously encourage all studiousness, but
Sure.
like, again, being a developer is hard. Like, it's already hard enough to make a website. Then throw in like, how do I get like Elasticsearch running on my computer? And it's just like not fair anymore. So that's like the problem that we're trying to solve, I think.
Yeah. And it's a problem worth solving, because I think it opens up the space to more people. Some people are really good at thinking in an application space, but thinking in an engineering or a DevOps or a hosting space just isn't something that either comes naturally to them or that they ever learnt about. So I think it's really cool that it kind of bridges that to some extent. So let's take the conversation in a slightly different direction. I think it's super interesting that two open source tools got together to solve a problem rather than trying to, kind of roll your own. Mike, on Tandem side, you from as far as I know, don't have a hosting platform, and we had Pygmy, or Amazy.io had Pygmy, and has Pygmy, and will probably continue to build it out. But I think this partnership is kind of interesting, and an interesting open source case study, for want of a better word. So how maybe you can just give us a bit of an overview of how this came about, what the conversations were. How did you decide to, hey, instead of rolling our own, let's work together? You've touched on it a bit, but let's go a bit deeper there.
I go back to that DrupalCon like 4 years ago, where it was like there was a bunch of people in the room, and it went exactly the way that I thought that it would. Where everyone wanted to like sort of guard their own solution and their own technology and stuff, and totally get that, totally understand like why people feel that way. But then I remember when Michael spoke, and I was like, okay, at least one person here besides me, I think, gets it. which is that like it's, and it, I felt sort of bad because like Lando really wasn't trying, like I didn't want Lando to be the one thing for everybody in that sort of way. It was really meant to be like this can interact with like the idea here is to interact with all the other things, to connect the things together, not to sort of be the walled garden. And I remember when Michael basically expressed the same desire, I was like, oh, there's clearly like a very deep fundamental understanding here that of how the tool should work and how these things should connect together. So to me, that was like the sort of foundational moment.
From our side, like I said, when we created Pygmy, it was more out of a necessity. And we always discussed about, like, Pygmy, for example, never really had any good Windows support. And so we knew that there will be a time that at one point the customer comes to us and says, look, I'm all developing in Windows. Yeah, you have maybe a solution, but it's not a really nice one. And so at the end, it was also a business decision from us as a hosting company. Like, we wanted to provide really great development tools for our developers. Like, we believe that it is the hosting company's responsibility to provide also really good tools. And so we decided, okay, we could hire a couple of developers and create basically a complete separate stream of, beside the platform or the application delivery to Lagoon, is to also create a really good local development system. And so, or we could say, we look into the open source space and say, instead of us paying developers to build our own thing, we can invest into an already existing tool and make it better. And so that was really at the time, I don't know how, it was probably like a year or 1.5 ago, with like all these discussions we already had. We always liked Lando. We sometimes like used it for other stuff. And so there were also all these discussions within the Drupal community to not only unify the Docker images we're using, but maybe actually standardize on one tool. But like it is, you put 12 people together and instead you have a 13th tool instead of a single tool. And so we said, okay, we'll like look a bit into the environment or into the community and see where it is going. And at the time we saw, as we are working a lot with agencies, a lot of time that we talked to them, they all told us, yeah, we're really thinking about standardizing on Lando. So we said, okay, that's probably the place to be. And so we reached out and said, hey, could we work together there? What is a commercial way that the two companies can invest into each other, but at the end to keep everything we do open source? So that's how we did it from the very beginning. We had a public alpha release of the integration, and now we're at the beta stage, and we're really interested to hear feedback, because we want to make Lando the default, that like if you are a Lagoon user, that you get Lando automatically installed, or like it is already suggested there that like our examples have Lando YAML files in there, so you can just run it locally and you don't have to do anything at all. So that's like the end goal to reach, because we really believe that Docker itself will probably never do that. They clearly said they are not going to focus on that specific use case for Docker for desktop. I'm not sure I would agree with them as a company decision, but well, that's their decision. And I also believe that we as a company that focuses on the platform and Lagoon, which focuses on the delivery of the app, should not really focus on that at all.
Yeah, I also think that there's this sort of bad assumption that a lot of people make, that because Lando is sort of like our side project and it's an open source thing, that it's somehow easy to like solve local development. And it's not. Just spoiler alert, it's not easy to do this. This is actually a very hard problem to solve. And just because Lando is using Docker containers and Lagoon is using Docker containers, they're not the same problem. Like solving Lando is not the same as solving hosting. So I think a lot of companies, they get into this weird situation where it's like, oh, like we start to go down that path because we think that they're similar. We realize that we're not. We realize that it's a lot harder. We realize, oh, this is actually sort of a distraction from our core mission. And then we also realize that even if we are to like go down that road and make our own thing, we've developed something that developers don't really want. Like they don't want to have the Lagoon solution, the platform solution, they want the one developer tool that they can use on all of their things. So I feel like once you start to go down that pathway, I think like pretty soon along that path, you realize, oh, it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to actually do this ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can totally echo that. Like the problems that we're facing of running stuff like 24/7 in an HA capability is completely different problems than trying to support every Windows and Mac version. And now, I mean, now all the Apple Silicon stuff, I mean, have fun, Mike, with all that fun.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so
my MacBook's in the mail right now.
So, I mean, we also have to change our images. So that's the other fun piece on our side.
Yeah.
But I mean, there are completely different problems and solutions to them.
I mean, you've both touched on something I think is maybe an important topic as well, is most agencies these days don't have a single hosting, or can't commit, like you say, Mike, to a single hosting provider, especially as as privacy and security become a thing. Some companies dictate where their stuff needs to live, right, where their website and their things needs to be hosted. But I'm seeing it more on the other side as well, which is people, a lot of agencies are no longer just doing Drupal. Even agencies that were traditionally very Drupal focused are branching out into other other technologies, for want of a better word. So I know that both tools can do both, but maybe talk a little bit about how having these tooling, and also very specifically, what have you seen running in the different tools? I mean, I think we can probably agree Drupal is there, but beyond Drupal, you know, what other technology are you seeing running inside these tools?
You go, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, the idea with Lando is you can run sort of whatever. I mean, I think our opinion is that the landscape is getting more complex and is changing faster, not the other way around. So if the interface that the developer has to interact with those projects remains consistent, regardless of how the projects themselves change. So, you know, whether your project moves from Pantheon to Amazy, if you still git clone it and Lando start it, and that experience is the same, then that's a win. But in terms of specific things, I mean, like the obvious ones are the PHP adjacent projects. So like WordPress and Laravel and Symfony and those kinds of things. But decoupled obviously is a big thing as well. So, you know, being able to run a decoupled project and develop that locally, I think is a big deal. But we have people who use Lando with like Python. We have a few like .NET developers who use it. So really it's any kind of project.
Cool.
Yeah,
what
on
about
our
the hosting side, Mike?
So I think there is probably like 3 different hats that I can answer you. Like as a Lagoon maintainer, I will tell you that Lagoon is container based. So whatever you can put into a container, Lagoon will deploy for you. And fun fact, actually, Lagoon version 1 is deployed by Lagoon itself. So you use Lagoon to deploy itself. So that includes actually like a microservice architecture of like 20 different containers, including Elasticsearch and Keycloak, which is based on Java, and some Go systems, a lot of Node.js and other services. So I guess Lagoon itself is probably the biggest Lagoon project. With Lagoon 2 that will come out quite soon, we decided to go away from that because we realized that it's a bit too crazy of an idea to do that, and it's also not really necessary. So we're going to have Helm charts that deploy Lagoon, but actual applications, yeah, I mean, right now we have a lot of Drupal and PHP based. So we see a lot of push into Laravel, specifically for just like super simple sites that don't need the complexity of Drupal, that just need like one single form to fill out something. Of course, a lot of push into decoupled with Gatsby or React, and also more just Node.js plain apps themselves that maybe talk to some applications. And from there, though, we see also pushes into Python, a lot of CCAN, DCAN pieces. So like in open data, that's definitely a big piece. We see a big push into Matomo because Google Analytics is more and more not allowed anymore for people to use for analytics because of data privacy or data privacy concerns. So, but really, like, there is no end. The piece that I would say with an Amazy.io hat on is who maintains all of these. Like in the end, you need to maintain Docker images that create the base for the application to run on, and you need to create the Helm charts that Lagoon will use to actually deploy to Kubernetes. Now, we offer specific ones that are maintained by Amazy.io. So we continuously monitor them, we update them. And so like that's Drupal, WordPress, PHP, all Node.js, that is all covered. If you bring something very exotic, while you can, there might not be the same amount of support that we can provide. So that's where then we have a very open discussion with our customers saying, look, you can deploy that. We will not prevent you from doing this. We just need to understand that the amount of level of support is not the same right now. But the idea is also to have some kind of Lagoon community where other people can contribute these templates or plugins or whatever we want to call them to support more of them. And I think that's very similar also for Lando, where like people, I mean, as it's open source, you can contribute. And if you want to create, how you call them, recipes, Mike, that other people can also deploy additional things. So that's something we also want to do, that we can say, okay, there might be fully supported ways. And then there's like the half supported community things. And then there's the land of do whatever you want place.
Yeah. The land of do whatever you want place is going to be an interesting space for both these projects. I think it'll probably be a good source of inspiration for like, you know, crazy but cool ideas for the future. So I'm interested to hear if either of you have had this moment. Like I love seeing when, you know, people who have kickstarted projects get that like, whoa, that's cool moment when they see some company or some initiative or organization using their stuff. And are like, oh, it's very cool to, you know, that somebody used that. Is there anything on either of your, you know, maybe Mike from Tandem's side or from Lando's side at least, where you were like, oh, that's super cool that organization is using Lando?
Yeah, I mean, I think we certainly have that. I mean, to us, I think the most exciting that's cool moment has been when hosting providers have reached out to us being like, can you solve this problem for us? So, you know, for the longest time, we basically just had a Pantheon integration. So like tip of the hat to Pantheon for being the first mover there. Cool. But over the last year or so, like, you know, we've worked with Amazy, which we've wanted to do for a long time because we feel like there's always been a deep-seated cultural similarity there with open source and other values. But Platform has reached out, and we're currently speaking with Acquia and WordPress VIP. Sorry, it's a Drupal conference, but you know, WordPress VIP and some other people as well. And so that's been the big thing for us, is other people realizing, oh, this is a problem. It's like not obvious. It's not as easy as we thought a problem to solve. Like somebody else has solved it pretty well. And you know, we don't want to just build more walled gardens. We want to have a single tool that connect to all these things. So to us, that's been the biggest, like, oh, this is like so cool that people are doing this. There's like a couple of organizations that like have used Lando that we've been excited about that I'll like just not name on air.
I did decide to put you both on the spot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, it's similar on my side. I'm not like, we had a couple of DrupalCons where people walk up to our booth and say like, hey, thanks a lot for the images because we're using it on xxwhatever.com website. And you're like, wait, what? You're using that on like a top 1,000 website in the world? Our Docker images are running. They're like, yeah, I mean, they're open source. We modify them a bit, but they're super great because they have all these things in it. And I'm like, okay, can I please talk about this? And they're like, yeah, no, sorry. There's not really like, but I mean, one thing I can talk about is the Australian government, where we, 2 years ago, we migrated a lot of sites over to Lagoon and on a dedicated cluster that is running for the government because it's a high security environment. But in the end, they use the regular open source Lagoon version. And that's what is really nice to see, that actually a government decides to support open source. And there's actually in the contract things in there that does not allow us to run a specific Lagoon version only for them. So we have to open source everything, which is crazy to see this like in a contract written down that requires you to open source everything you do, which is great. Like I really would love to see more of this. And so the piece that that was for me crazy to see is this whole COVID traffic. Like the Australian government, of course, created specific websites for the whole COVID situation, and like the fact that we saw that new websites are built within days. They created completely new websites, and then also have like millions of people visiting this every hour. Like one of the fun things is that they told us 15 minutes, though they opened a critical ticket and said, hey, we're going to send a text message to every Australian citizen in 15 minutes. And you're like, okay, I guess now there's nothing we can do anymore. Like there's no way that you can now scale up the cluster. You just have to hope that everything works. And the cluster handled all of it itself. It scaled itself up. It works flawlessly. And that's really awesome to see, like, because, you know, we talk a lot about auto scaling capabilities and things, but like, and a lot of times, like, you cannot really test it because there is not really this crazy event where, like, yeah, an endless amount of traffic comes in. So that's definitely really nice to see that governments really trust open source and invest into it. And I think that in the end helps all of us because we build better tools, open source them again.
Awesome. But by extension, it's cool because if they're using, you know, if they're using Lagoon, then there's a good chance they'll probably use Lando at the end of the day as well.
Totally.
So that's very exciting to know the Australian government is using Lando. And it's also been exciting. There's like, I think the Department of Energy and some other like larger universities are using Lando. That's all very exciting. But to me, actually, to think about an example that I saw recently, like there's a company called Bramble, and they make vegetarian dog food. And they are also using Lando. So I'm just like, you know, I feel like both ends of the spectrum are sort of covered, right? Like you've got like this large university that's like running Lando, and that like sort of makes sense to some degree. But then you also have like smaller, you know, much smaller companies that have like probably a single developer who are also using this tool. So I think that speaks to the breadth of coverage that like a tool that Lando and Lagoon as well can sort of provide.
Awesome. So we've only got 2 questions, and they're both from Thomas. So hi, Thomas. So one for Lagoon and one for Lando. So we've got 2 minutes left. So in a brief answer, starting with Lagoon, is Elasticsearch soon to be supported with Lagoon Lando? Either of you? Sorry, Michael, you can, Mike Schmidt. Elasticsearch soon to be supported with Lagoon Lando?
So we do have support for Elasticsearch in Lagoon. I'm not sure if we are there yet for Lando locally, though, Mike.
I don't believe that Elasticsearch is one of the supported services that we have currently. Running Elasticsearch locally is actually sort of a pain sometimes, because it just takes a lot of resources to run it. So I think that there were some hiccups when we tried to do it initially, but it's something that will happen at some point. Lando by itself offers Elasticsearch, so
okay.
I'm guessing
that it shouldn't be.
Happen.
It shouldn't be too hard. So Dominic, Tom, if this is something that you need, please talk to either your TAM on Amazy side or just open a GitHub issue, and we're happy to focus on that, because yeah, we're really at a point that like we built the first implementation and now we want to see where it goes. So this feedback is very important for us, that we know, okay, where do we have to steer and put our focus on.
Awesome.
Yep. I think there's a few other services besides Elasticsearch that aren't currently supported for the Lagoon integration. I will say though, as a workaround though, like you certainly can like add the Lando Elasticsearch in the meantime and use that if you'd like to.
Cool. Awesome. So we have literally 1 minute left. So closing remarks. How do people best find out more, and how do they engage with these projects? Starting with Lando, Mike.
Just lando.dev.
Cool. There we go. There you have it. Go to lando.dev. Michael, Lagoon side, how do people get started? How do they play?
There is lagoon.sh, which is a redirect to our Amazy.io website, where you can find more about this. But in the end, you can find us on GitHub, on Twitter, like in Slack. Just ping us wherever you want. Usually we'll find people that can answer.
Awesome. Great stuff. We'll continue hanging around the booth, or at least the session, for a little while. Thomas will answer your questions, and Michael, I see a question coming in as well. Thanks, everybody. It's been great. Thank you for hanging out with us and listening to us, and we'll see you around DrupalCon.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody.